The morning sun barely broke through the thick windows of Riverside State Correctional Facility when Dr. Elena Rodriguez heard the alarm bells. She had been working as a behavioral specialist at the prison for 3 years, but the sound still made her heart race. Today felt different, though. The guards were running faster, their voices more urgent than usual. "Lock down Block D," someone shouted down the hallway. "He's done it again." Elena knew immediately who he was. Everyone in the facility knew about the man they called Rage, a nickname that had followed him through multiple prisons over the past decade. His real name was David Thompson, but nobody used it anymore. At 29 years old, he had become a legend in the worst possible way. She grabbed her clipboard and headed toward Block D, even though she wasn't supposed to. Something pulled her in that direction, a feeling she couldn't shake. As she walked, other staff members passed her going the opposite way, shaking their heads and muttering about that maniac and how some people just can't be helped. When Elena reached Block D, she found chaos. 3 guards stood outside cell 47, all of them looking shaken. One had a cut on his cheek, another was holding his wrist, and the third was on his radio calling for backup. Through the small window in the cell door, she could see movement inside, but couldn't make out much detail. "What happened?" Elena asked Officer Martinez, who had been at the prison longer than anyone else. "Same old story," Martinez replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Thompson went crazy during meal distribution. Johnson tried to give him his tray, and Thompson grabbed him through the slot. Took 3 of us to get Johnson free. Now he's barricaded himself in there with a broken chair leg." Elena looked through the window again. She could see David sitting on his bunk, his back against the wall. Even from this angle, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held the makeshift weapon. But something about his posture struck her as odd. He wasn't pacing like an angry animal, he wasn't shouting threats, he was just sitting. "Has anyone tried to talk to him?" she asked. Martinez laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Talk to Rage? Lady, that man hasn't had a normal conversation in years. He speaks in threats and violence. The only language he understands is force." More guards arrived, carrying riot, shields, and tasers. Elena watched them form up outside the cell door, preparing for what everyone seemed to think was inevitable, a violent confrontation that would end with David in solitary confinement or worse. Captain Brooks, the head of security, arrived and took charge. He was a big man with gray hair and tired eyes who had seen too much violence in his 25 years at the prison. "All right, here's how this goes," he announced to his team. "We go in hard and fast. Thompson is dangerous, and he's already hurt Johnson. We can't let this escalate." Elena felt her stomach drop. She had been observing David for months, not officially, but whenever their paths crossed in the prison. There was something about him that didn't match his reputation. Yes, he was involved in fights, but she had noticed patterns. He never started conflicts with weaker inmates. His violence always seemed to have a purpose, a protection element that others missed. "Wait," Elena said, stepping forward. The guards turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. "Ma'am, you need to step back," Captain Brooks said firmly. "This is a security situation." "I know, but I think there might be another way," Elena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let me try talking to him first." The silence that followed was deafening. Several guards exchanged glances that clearly said they thought she had lost her mind. Martinez shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Dr. Rodriguez," Captain Brooks said carefully, "I appreciate your dedication to rehabilitation, but Thompson isn't like your other patients. He's violent, unpredictable, and right now, he's armed. We can't risk civilian safety." "But what if he's not unpredictable?" Elena pressed. "What if there's a reason for his behavior that we're not seeing?" "The reason is that he's a violent criminal," Officer Johnson said, still holding his injured wrist. "Look what he did to me just for trying to give him lunch." Elena looked at Johnson's wrist, then back at the cell door. Something about the story didn't add up. In her experience, random violence usually had underlying causes: fear, trauma, misunderstanding. She had seen it countless times in her work. "Please," she said to Captain Brooks. "Give me 10 minutes. If I can't get through to him, if there's any sign of danger, I'll step back immediately." The captain studied her face for a long moment. Elena could see him weighing the risks, considering the paperwork nightmare that would follow if something went wrong. But she also saw something else in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even hope. "This is insane," Martinez muttered. "That man has put more guards in the hospital than any other inmate in this place." "And yet," Elena said quietly, "he's never seriously injured anyone. Hurt, yes. But killed? Permanently disabled? No. For someone supposedly as dangerous as his reputation suggests, his track record is surprisingly restrained." Captain Brooks raised an eyebrow at that observation. Elena could see she had planted a seed of doubt about the simple narrative everyone had accepted. 10 minutes, he finally said. "But the moment things go bad, we're going in with everything we've got. I won't lose an officer to prove a point about rehabilitation." Elena nodded, her heart pounding. She approached the cell door slowly, her hands visible and empty. Through the small window, she could see David watching her approach. His eyes were dark and alert, tracking her every movement. "David?" she called through the door. "My name is Elena. I'm a counselor here at the prison. Can we talk?" There was no response, but she noticed he shifted slightly on his bunk. The chair leg was still in his hands, but he wasn't gripping it as tightly as before. "I know you're upset," she continued. "Something happened during lunch that made you feel threatened. I'd like to understand what that was." "Go away," came a voice from inside the cell. It was deeper than she had expected, rougher, but not as menacing as she had imagined. "I could do that," Elena replied calmly. "But then the guards are going to come in with tasers and riot gear, and someone's going to get hurt. Maybe you, maybe them. I don't think that's what you want." There was a longer pause this time. Elena could hear shuffling inside the cell like David was moving around. "You don't know what I want," he said finally. "You're right, I don't," Elena admitted. "But I know what I see. I see someone who's scared and trying to protect himself. I see someone who's tired of fighting but doesn't know how to stop." Behind her, she could hear the guards shifting restlessly. She knew they thought she was wasting time, maybe even making the situation worse. But something in David's silence told her she was on the right track. "David, I've been watching you," she said. "Not officially, but I notice things. You help the older inmates carry their meal trays. You don't pick fights with the smaller guys. Yesterday, I saw you give your dessert to that new kid who was crying. That doesn't sound like someone who just wants to hurt people." "You don't know anything about me," David said, but his voice had changed. The anger was still there, but underneath it, Elena heard something else. Pain, maybe. Exhaustion. "Then help me understand," she replied. "Help me see what really happened today." The cell went quiet for what felt like an eternity. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, the shuffling of the guards behind her, the distant sounds of the prison continuing its daily routine despite the drama unfolding in Block D. "Johnson grabbed my wrist," David said suddenly. "When he handed me the tray, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed. Hard. Said something about teaching me respect." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced back at Officer Johnson, who was looking at the floor and wouldn't meet her eyes. "That must have been scary," she said to David. "Being grabbed like that, not knowing what was coming next?" "Don't get scared," David replied quickly. But Elena heard the lie in his voice. "Everyone gets scared sometimes," she said gently. "There's no shame in that. The question is what we do when we're scared. Do we fight, or do we find another way?" "Fighting is all I know," David said. And for the first time, Elena heard genuine sadness in his voice. "Maybe," she replied. "But maybe it's time to learn something new. Maybe it's time to let someone help you." There was another long silence. Elena could feel the tension from the guards behind her, knew that Captain Brooks was probably checking his watch and getting ready to call off her attempt. "Why?" David asked finally. "Why would you want to help me? Everyone else has given up." Elena thought about that question, about all the reasons she could give. Because rehabilitation was her job. Because everyone deserved a second chance. Because the system was supposed to help people change, not just lock them away. But what came out of her mouth was simpler and more honest than any of those answers. Because when I look at you, I don't see a monster, she said. I see someone who's been hurt and is hurting others because he doesn't know any other way to survive. I see someone who's worth saving, even if he doesn't see it himself. The silence that followed was different from the others. It felt less hostile, more thoughtful. Elena waited, barely breathing for David's response. 3 days after the incident in Block D, Elena sat across from David Thompson in a small counseling room. The space was designed to be calming, soft lighting, neutral colors, comfortable chairs instead of the usual metal stools bolted to the floor. But David sat rigid in his chair, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist, staring at a point somewhere over Elena's left shoulder. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Elena had prepared for this moment, reading every file, every incident report, every scrap of documentation about David's 12 years in the system. What she found was a pattern of escalating security measures and increasingly violent incidents, but very little about the person behind the prisoner number. You saved my career the other day, Elena said finally, breaking the silence. Captain, Brooks was ready to write me up for interfering in a security situation. When you cooperated, it made me look good instead of foolish. David's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment before returning to their fixed point on the wall. Don't thank me, I just got tired of fighting. Is that what it was? Fatigue? What else would it be? David's voice carried that familiar edge, but Elena was learning to listen for what lay beneath the surface. I don't know. Maybe you were curious about someone who saw you differently than everyone else does. David snorted, a sound that might have been laughter in different circumstances. Lady, you don't see me any different. You just think you do. Give it time. I'll disappoint you like I've disappointed everyone else. Elena leaned forward slightly in her chair. What makes you so sure of that? Because that's what I do. That's all I do. David's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like he was stating the weather. I hurt people, I break things, I make bad situations worse. It's what I'm good at. Is it what you want to be good at? The question seemed to catch David off guard. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought he might explode into anger. Instead, he went very still. Doesn't matter what I want, he said quietly. Why not? Because wanting things is how you get hurt. Elena felt her heart ache at the simple truth in those words. She had read about David's childhood in the files, foster homes, abuse, abandonment. But hearing the pain in his voice made it real in a way that paperwork never could. Tell me about the first time you got arrested, she said, changing the subject slightly. David's laugh this time was bitter. Which time? I've been getting arrested since I was 13. The very first time. What happened? David was quiet for so long that Elena began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, like he was remembering something that happened to someone else. There was this kid in my foster home, Tommy. He was maybe 8 years old, small for his age, the foster father. David stopped, his hands clenching into fists despite the chains. He was hurting Tommy, every night. And Tommy would cry, but nobody did anything about it. Elena waited, sensing there was more to the story. One night I heard Tommy screaming, and I couldn't take it anymore. I went into that man's room with a baseball bat. David's voice got quieter. I didn't kill him, but I put him in the hospital for a long time. They arrested me for assault with a deadly weapon. How old were you? 13. Elena felt sick. A 13-year-old boy, trying to protect an even younger child, and the system had labeled him a violent criminal. What happened to Tommy? They moved him to a different home. I never saw him again. But at least he was safe. David finally looked directly at Elena. That was the first time I learned that sometimes violence is the only thing people understand. And you've been carrying that lesson ever since. It's kept me alive. Elena studied David's face, seeing the intelligence there that everyone else seemed to miss. Has it, though? Or has it just kept you isolated and angry? David's eyes flashed with something that might have been hurt. Same thing, isn't it? I don't think so. Being alive means more than just surviving. It means connection, hope, growth. When's the last time you felt any of those things? The question seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He looked away again, his breathing becoming slightly uneven. Connection gets you hurt, he said finally. Hope is a lie. And growth? What's the point of growing when you're locked in a cage? Elena reached into her bag and pulled out something that made David's eyes widen in surprise. A chess set. Not the cheap plastic kind used in most prison programs, but a real wooden set with carved pieces. I found something interesting in your juvenile file, Elena said, setting the board between them. Your first foster mother, Mrs. Patterson, wrote that you loved chess. She said you taught yourself from a library book and could beat adults twice your age. David stared at the chess set like it might bite him. That was a long time ago. Do you still remember how to play? I remember a lot of things. Doesn't mean they matter anymore. Elena began setting up the pieces anyway. Humor me. One game. I'm chained to this chair. How am I supposed to move pieces? I'll move them for you, just tell me where you want each piece to go. David watched her set up the board, and despite his efforts to remain indifferent, Elena could see interest flickering in his eyes. You're wasting your time. It's my time to waste. Elena finished setting up the pieces and gestured toward the board. White or black? David stared at the board for a long moment. Elena could see him fighting with himself, part of him wanting to engage while another part warned him against caring about anything. White, he said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. White it is. Your move. David studied the board with an intensity that surprised Elena. She had expected him to make casual moves, maybe even purposely lose to prove his point about disappointment. Instead, he approached the game with serious concentration. Pawn 2, e4, he said. Elena moved the piece and responded with her own move. As the game progressed, she watched David's entire demeanor change. The tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly. His breathing became more regular. Most importantly, he began to make eye contact, studying not just the board but Elena's face, trying to read her strategy. You're better than I expected, David said after Elena captured one of his knights. Thanks, I think. Most people who try to help me don't bother to learn what I actually care about. They assume they know what I need. Elena made her next move and leaned back in her chair. What do you think you need? David considered the question while studying the board. I used to think I needed everyone to be afraid of me. If they're afraid, they leave you alone. If they leave you alone, they can't hurt you. Used to think? Now I'm not so sure. David moved his queen into position. Check. Elena smiled and moved her king to safety. What changed your mind? You. The word came out before David could. Stop it. And Elena saw him immediately tense up as if he had revealed too much. Me? David was quiet for several moves, clearly regretting his honesty. But eventually, he continued. You weren't afraid of me. Even when I was holding a weapon, even when everyone else was sure I was dangerous, you just talked to me like I was a person. You are a person. Are you sure about that? David's voice carried genuine doubt. Sometimes I feel like I've been pretending to be human for so long that I forgot what the real thing feels like. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had a feeling that pity was the last thing David needed right now. When you protected Tommy, when you gave your dessert to that scared kid last week, when you helped the older inmates with their meal trays, those weren't the actions of someone pretending to be human. Those were the actions of someone with a good heart who's been forced to hide it behind armor. David made a mistake on his next move, something Elena was sure was unintentional. His hands were shaking slightly. The armor feels so heavy sometimes, he admitted quietly. But I don't know how to take it off. I don't know who I'd be without it. Maybe that's something we could figure out together. David looked up from the board, meeting Elena's eyes for the first time since the session began. Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to waste time on someone like me? Elena moved her piece and sat back, considering her words carefully. Because I don't think you're someone to waste time on. I think you're someone who's been overlooked, misunderstood, and written off by a system that finds it easier to label you as irredeemable than to do the hard work of seeing who you really are. And who do you think I really am? I think you're someone who has spent his entire life protecting people weaker than himself, even when it cost you everything. I think you're incredibly intelligent, but you've never been given the chance to use that intelligence constructively. I think you're scared of hope because hope has been used as a weapon against you so many times. David was quiet for a long time, staring at the chessboard. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if you're wrong? What if I really am just a violent person who can't be helped? Elena leaned forward, making sure David was looking at her when she answered. Then we'll deal with that reality when we come to it. But I don't think I'm wrong. And more importantly, I think deep down you don't think I'm wrong either. David made his next move, and Elena realized that despite the heavy conversation, he had been playing brilliantly. In 3 more moves, he would have checkmate. 2 months had passed since Elena's first chess game with David, and their weekly sessions had become the highlight of both their schedules. The small counseling room had transformed from a sterile meeting space into something that felt almost comfortable. A place where David could slowly let his guard down and remember what it felt like to be seen as more than just a threat. On this particular Tuesday morning, Elena arrived at the prison to find an unusual buzz of activity in the staff break room. Officers were clustered around someone's phone, their voices animated with excitement. "Did you guys see the news about the Richardson case?" Officer Martinez was saying. "That guy who's been fighting his conviction for armed robbery? Turns out, he was right all along. DNA evidence just cleared him after 8 years." Elena's heart skipped a beat. She knew that case. David had been talking about it for weeks, convinced that Richardson was innocent based on inconsistencies he had spotted in the trial transcripts. "How did they finally figure it out?" someone asked. Some legal aid lawyer noticed problems with the prosecution's timeline, the same issues that Richardson kept bringing up in his appeals. But nobody would listen. Elena felt a mix of excitement and dread as she walked toward the counseling room. David was going to be vindicated about Richardson, but she also knew how he felt about the justice system's failures. This news could either encourage him or send him spiraling into anger about all the other innocent people who weren't getting heard. When David entered the room 20 minutes later, Elena could see immediately that he had already heard. His usual, guarded expression was replaced by something more complex. Satisfaction mixed with frustration, hope tempered by cynicism. "I told you Richardson was innocent," David said before he had even fully sat down. "I've been telling everyone who would listen for 2 years." "You did," Elena agreed. "You were right. How does that feel?" David's laugh was hollow. "It feels like a waste. Richardson lost 8 years of his life because nobody wanted to listen to a convict's analysis of legal documents. 8 years, Elena. His daughter was 10 when he went in. She's 18 now. He missed everything." Elena could hear the pain in David's voice, and she suspected it wasn't just about Richardson. "You identify with him?" "Of course I do. We both know what it's like to be judged before anyone bothers to understand the facts." Elena had been looking forward to this conversation for weeks, but now she approached it carefully. "David, I've been reading your case files. All of them. Not just the incident reports, but the trial transcripts, the appeals, everything." David went very still. "Why?" "Because I wanted to understand your story, not just the version everyone tells about you." David's hands clenched in his lap. "And what did you find? Proof that I'm the monster everyone says I am?" "I found something very different," Elena said gently. "I found a pattern that nobody else seemed to notice." She opened her folder and pulled out a timeline she had spent weeks creating. "Your first adult conviction, assault on a corrections officer named Williams. But buried in the witness statements, I found testimony that Williams was sexually abusing inmates in his block. Your attack stopped that abuse." David's jaw tightened. Nobody cared about that part. "Your second conviction, aggravated assault on 3 men outside a convenience store. But the police report mentions that those 3 men had just robbed and beaten an elderly store clerk. Security footage shows them running out of the store with stolen money when you intervened. The footage was ruled inadmissible due to some technical issue, David said quietly. Elena flipped to the next page. The bar fight that added 2 years to your sentence. 5 witnesses testified that you started the fight. But one witness, who was never called to testify, gave a statement to police saying those 5 men were harassing 2 young women who were trying to leave. You stepped in when nobody else would. David was staring at the table now, his breathing shallow. Why are you doing this? Because I need you to understand something, Elena said, her voice firm but gentle. You're not a violent criminal who occasionally does good things. You're a protector who lives in a world that punishes protection and rewards looking the other way. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see David struggling with emotions he had buried for years. Validation, grief, anger at the unfairness of it all. It doesn't matter, David said finally. The system doesn't care about context, it only cares about outcomes. I hurt people, so I'm the bad guy. End of story. Maybe the system doesn't care, but I do. And I think you do too. Even if you've tried to stop caring. Elena pulled out another document. David, did you know that you taught yourself constitutional law using the prison library? I had to. Nobody else was going to fight for me. Your legal briefs are better written than some I've seen from licensed attorneys. You have an exceptional legal mind. David shrugged, but Elena could see that the compliment meant something to him. Fat lot of good it's done me. What if it could do some good? What if there was a way to use your intelligence and your passion for justice to help people instead of just surviving? Like how? Elena had been preparing for this moment for weeks. I want to recommend you for a new program I'm developing. It's called Second Chance Legal Aid. Inmates with legal knowledge would work with volunteer lawyers to help other prisoners with their cases. David looked up sharply. You want me to become a jailhouse lawyer? I want you to become what you already are, someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. But I want you to do it in a way that builds things instead of breaking them. David was quiet for a long time, and Elena could see him thinking through the implications. Nobody's going to take legal advice from someone like me. Someone like what? Someone who's intelligent? Someone who's spent 12 years studying the system from the inside? Someone who's never lost a case when he's advocated for himself or others? Someone with a record like mine? Elena leaned forward. David, your record shows someone who has consistently put others' safety above his own freedom. Yes, you've been violent. But your violence has always been protective, never predatory. That's not a weakness. It's a strength that's been misunderstood. She could see David wavering, hope and fear battling in his eyes. What if I screw it up? What if I lose control and prove everyone right about me? What if you don't? What if this is your chance to show the world who David Thompson really is instead of who everyone assumes him to be? David was quiet for so long that Elena began to worry she had pushed too hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I used to want to be a lawyer, before everything went wrong. I used to dream about fighting for justice, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. What changed? Life. The system. Learning that nobody cares about justice when you're poor and powerless and have no one to speak for you. Elena felt her heart break for the boy David had been, full of dreams that had been crushed by circumstances beyond his control. Maybe nobody spoke for you then, but you have a voice now, and you could use it to speak for others. David looked at the chess set that had become a permanent fixture in their sessions. What would this program actually involve? Research mainly. Reading case files, looking for errors, inconsistencies, missed opportunities for appeal. Working with volunteer attorneys to develop legal strategies, helping other inmates understand their rights and options. Like what I did for Richardson. Exactly, like what you did for Richardson. Except this time there would be lawyers listening, not just guards rolling their eyes. David made a move on the chessboard, then looked directly at Elena. Why me? Why are you willing to risk your career on someone everyone else has written off? Elena had asked herself that question countless times over the past 2 months. The answer was complicated, involving her own background, her beliefs about redemption, her frustration with a system that seemed designed to give up on people. But the simplest answer was also the truest. Because when I look at you, I don't see a criminal who occasionally does good things. I see a good person who's been forced into terrible situations and made the best choices he could with limited options. I see someone who's never stopped fighting for what's right. Even when fighting cost him everything. David's next move on the chessboard was brilliant, setting up a combination that would give him checkmate in 4 moves. But instead of pressing his advantage, he sat back in his chair. Dr. Rodriguez, Elena, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you really believe people can change? I mean fundamentally change, not just learn to hide their true nature better? Elena considered the question carefully. I believe people can grow into who they were always meant to be, if they're given the chance and the support they need. I don't think you need to change, David. I think you need to heal. What's the difference? Change implies there's something wrong with who you are. Healing recognizes that you're already the person you're supposed to be. But life has wounded you and taught you survival strategies that no longer serve you. David was quiet again. But this time the silence felt different. Contemplative rather than defensive. If I do this program, he said finally, and if I help people, and if I don't screw everything up, what then? I still have 6 years left on my sentence. This doesn't get me out any faster. The Second Chance Legal Aid Program launched on a cold Monday morning in October, 6 months after Elena had first walked into David's cell. The program had faced resistance from day one. Budget concerns from administrators, safety worries from guards, and skepticism from inmates who couldn't believe someone like David would be allowed to help with legal work. Elena sat in the converted classroom that now served as the program's headquarters, watching David organize case files with the same precision he brought to chess. 3 other inmates had been selected for the pilot program, but it was clear that David was the driving force behind its early success. Thompson, you need to see this, called out Luis Morales, another program participant who was serving time for drug-related charges. Luis held up a thick folder with obvious excitement. The Johnson case. I think we found something. David looked up from his work, his expression immediately focused. Over the past few months, Elena had watched him transform from someone who used his intelligence for survival to someone who wielded it like a scalpel, cutting through legal complexity to find the truth hidden underneath. What did you find? David asked, moving to look over Luis's shoulder. Look at the timestamp on the arresting officer's report. He says he arrested Johnson at 11:47 p.m. on March 15th. But Johnson's cell phone records show he was talking to his sister in Detroit at 11:52 p.m. that same night. The call lasted 12 minutes. Elena watched David's eyes light up as he processed the information. This was the moment she loved most. Seeing him use his brilliant mind constructively instead of defensively. So either Johnson has the ability to be in 2 places at once, or Officer Bradley made a mistake in his report, David said with a slight smile. Luis, this is excellent work. Have you cross-referenced the cell tower data? That's what I was hoping you could help me with. You're better at the technical stuff. Elena felt a warm surge of pride as she watched the 2 men work together. David had become not just a participant in the program, but a mentor to the others. His natural leadership abilities, which had been channeled into survival and protection for so long, were finally being used to build something positive. The classroom door opened, and Captain Brooks entered with an expression Elena had learned to recognize, the look of someone bearing bad news. Dr. Rodriguez, I need to speak with you, he said, his tone formal. Elena followed him into the hallway, leaving the inmates to continue their work. She had been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since rumors started circulating about Thompson's special treatment. We have a problem, Captain Brooks said without preamble. Some of the other inmates are getting restless about your program. They think Thompson is getting special privileges. What kind of restlessness? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew. Complaints, mostly. Questions about why the most violent inmate in Block D gets to play lawyer while others can't, even get basic education classes. and some of the guards are uncomfortable with Thompson having access to legal files. Elena had been preparing for this moment since the program began. Captain, David's violence has always been protective, never predatory. His disciplinary record shows that clearly. His disciplinary record shows 15 major infractions over the past 5 years, Captain Brooks countered, including the incident that brought you two together in the first place. 15 incidents over 5 years in a population where some inmates rack up that many in a single month. And every single one of those incidents involved him protecting someone weaker. Captain, Brooks sighed. Elena, I'm not questioning your work or your judgment. Thompson has been a model participant in your program. But perception matters in here. If the other inmates think he's getting special treatment because of his relationship with you, it could create problems. Before Elena could respond, shouting erupted from the classroom behind them. Both Elena and Captain Brooks rushed back inside to find chaos. One of the other program participants, Robert Chen, was backed against a wall, while 3 inmates who weren't part of the program surrounded him menacingly. Think you're better than us now, Chen, one of them was saying. Playing lawyer with your buddy Thompson? David stood between Chen and the aggressive inmates, his posture tense but controlled. Elena could see him fighting every instinct that had kept him alive for 12 years. The urge to strike first, to use violence to solve the problem quickly and decisively. Back off, Rodriguez, David said quietly to the apparent leader of the group. Chen's not bothering anybody. Oh, look at this, Rodriguez sneered. The great Rage Thompson, defending his little legal aid friends. What happened to you, man? You used to be someone people respected. Elena held her breath, knowing that this moment would define everything. David's response would either validate her faith in his growth or destroy months of progress. I used to be someone people feared, David corrected, his voice steady. That's not the same thing as respect. Fear works better than respect in here, Rodriguez shot back. At least when people fear you, they leave you alone. David took a step closer to Rodriguez, and Elena saw the other man instinctively flinch. Even after months of focusing on legal work instead of violence, David's reputation preceded him. You're right, David said quietly. Fear does work. I could end this conversation right now in about 10 seconds. We both know that. Rodriguez nodded, clearly trying to decide whether to back down or escalate. But here's what I learned recently, David continued. Fear only works as long as you're willing to keep using it, and using it means never getting to be anything else. Never getting to help people instead of hurting them. Never getting to build something instead of just tearing things down. Elena could see Rodriguez wavering, caught between his desire to challenge David and his very rational fear of the consequences. So here's what's going to happen, David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority Elena had seen him develop over months of legal work. You're going to leave Chen alone. You're going to leave Luis alone. You're going to leave this program alone. Not because I'm threatening you, but because this is something good, and there's too little good in this place to waste it on petty jealousy. Rodriguez looked around the room, clearly calculating his options. Elena could see him realizing that backing down might be smarter than finding out whether David's commitment to non-violence had limits. This isn't over, Thompson, Rodriguez said, but his heart clearly wasn't in the threat. Yes, it is, David replied calmly. Because you're smart enough to know that fighting with me accomplishes nothing except getting us both thrown in solitary, and I've got too much work to do to waste time in the hole. As Rodriguez and his friends left, Elena felt a mixture of relief and admiration. David had handled the situation perfectly, using his reputation without resorting to violence, de-escalating without appearing weak. That was well done, Captain Brooks said quietly to David. But Rodriguez is right about one thing. This isn't over. Word's gonna spread that you backed down from a fight. David shrugged. Let it spread. Maybe other people will see that there are ways to solve problems besides hitting them. After Captain Brooks left and the other inmates returned to their work, Elena approached David at his desk. How do you feel about what just happened? David considered the question while organizing a stack of legal documents. Scared, he admitted. For months my reputation has been my shield. If people think I've gone soft, if they start testing me, you'll handle it the same way you handled Rodriguez. with intelligence instead of instinct. What if that's not enough? What if someone pushes hard enough that I have to choose between the program and protecting myself or someone else? Elena had been dreading this question, but she also knew it was inevitable. Then you'll make the best choice you can with the options you have, just like you always have. But David, look at what you accomplished today. You diffused a potentially violent situation without anyone getting hurt. You protected Chen, maintained your authority, and kept the program intact. That's not weakness. That's strength. David was quiet for a moment. Dr. Mitchell thinks I'm a walking time bomb, he said, referring to one of Elena's colleagues who had been vocal about his concerns regarding the program. Dr. Mitchell thinks everyone in here is a walking time bomb. He's been working corrections for 20 years, and he's forgotten that some people can actually change. Maybe he's right about me, though. Maybe I'm just one bad day away from proving everyone right about who I really am. Elena sat down across from David, looking directly into his eyes. David, I've seen you handle dozens of stressful situations over the past 6 months. I've seen you frustrated, angry, disappointed, and afraid. But I've never seen you lose control. I've never seen you hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. And I've never seen you give up on doing the right thing, even when it was harder than doing the wrong thing. This feels different, though. The stakes feel higher. The stakes are higher. You're not just surviving anymore, you're building something, you're creating a legacy that goes beyond your reputation. That's terrifying, but it's also beautiful. David returned to his paperwork, but Elena could see the wheels turning in his mind. Elena, can I ask you something? Always. 18 months had passed since David Thompson first participated in Elena's Second Chance Legal Aid program. On a crisp February morning, he walked through the prison gates carrying everything he owned in a worn canvas bag: legal books, letters from people he had helped, and a chess set that Elena had given him as a parole gift. Elena waited by her car in the parking lot, no longer his counselor but his friend and advocate. The past year and a half had transformed them both. Elena had become a recognized expert in prison rehabilitation, her program now implemented in 3 other facilities. David had become something no one thought possible, a success story. How does it feel? Elena asked as David approached her car, squinting in the bright sunlight he hadn't experienced without barriers in over a decade. Overwhelming, David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I keep expecting someone to tell me there's been a mistake, that I need to go back inside. Elena understood his fear. David's early release had come after his work with the legal aid program had helped overturn 17 wrongful convictions and identified procedural errors in hundreds of cases. The state parole board, impressed by his transformation and contributions, had granted him supervised release to a halfway house with the condition that he continue his legal advocacy work. The halfway house supervisor is expecting you this afternoon, Elena said as they drove through the city. I've already spoken with him about your situation. He understands that you're not a typical parolee. David watched the world pass by through the car window, seeing changes everywhere. Technology had advanced. Buildings had been constructed or torn down, and fashions had shifted in ways that made him feel like a time traveler. Elena, I need to ask you something, David said as they stopped at a red light. What if I can't handle this? What if being out here is too much, and I end up back inside? Elena had been expecting this question. David, do you remember our first chess game? You told me that fighting was all you knew. But over the past 18 months, you've learned that you know a lot more than fighting. You know how to research, how to write, how to mentor other people, how to find hope in hopeless situations. But that was inside a controlled environment. Out here, there are so many variables, so many ways things could go wrong. There are also so many ways things could go right. The halfway house was a converted Victorian home in a neighborhood that had seen better days but was slowly improving. As Elena helped David carry his few belongings inside, she could see him cataloging potential threats and escape routes, habits that would take time to unlearn. Mr. Thompson? A tall, gray-haired man emerged from an office. I'm Robert Williams, the house supervisor. Dr. Rodriguez has told me a lot about your work. David shook William's hand cautiously. Thank you for accepting me into the program. Thank you for the work you've been doing. My brother spent 3 years in Riverside before your legal aid program helped prove his innocence. He's home with his family now because of what you accomplished. Elena watched David's face as he processed this information. Over the months, he had become better at accepting credit for his positive contributions, but she could see it still surprised him when people thanked him instead of fearing him. The room David was assigned was small but clean, with a single bed, a desk, and a window that looked out onto a tree-lined street. After Elena left, David sat on the bed and tried to absorb the reality of his situation. For the first time in over 12 years, he could walk out the front door whenever he wanted. The freedom was terrifying. That evening, David made his first venture into the neighborhood, walking to a small grocery store 3 blocks away. The simple act of choosing what to eat for dinner felt overwhelming after years of institutional meals. He stood in the cereal aisle for 10 minutes, paralyzed by the dozens of options. "You okay, son?" asked an elderly woman who had noticed his confusion. David's first instinct was to be suspicious. In prison, unexpected interactions were usually threats, but something in the woman's genuine concern made him try a different approach. "I'm just adjusting to having choices again," he said honestly. The woman nodded with understanding. "Just got out?" David tensed, waiting for the fear or judgment that usually followed when people learned about his past. Instead, the woman smiled. "My grandson just came home from a long deployment overseas. Said the hardest part was learning to make civilian decisions again. Take your time, honey, the cereal will wait." As David finally selected a box of cornflakes, he realized that maybe the world outside wasn't entirely hostile to someone like him. Maybe there were people who could see past his history to who he was trying to become. His first week of freedom was a series of small victories and minor setbacks. He attended required meetings with his parole officer, who seemed genuinely impressed by his legal knowledge. He started volunteering at a legal aid clinic downtown, where attorneys were eager to utilize his unique expertise in criminal defense. But the nights were difficult. Without the constant background noise of prison, the silence felt oppressive. David found himself unable to sleep, checking locks repeatedly, startled by every sound. The freedom he had dreamed of for years now felt like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. "I keep thinking this is temporary," David confided to Elena during one of their weekly check-ins. "Like I'm just on some kind of extended leave and eventually they'll realize their mistake and bring me back." "What would help you believe that this is real?" Elena asked. David considered the question. "Maybe if I could do something meaningful, something that proves I belong out here." The opportunity came sooner than either of them expected. A local news station had heard about David's work with the legal aid program and wanted to do a story about prison rehabilitation. David's initial reaction was pure panic. "I can't go on television," he told Elena. "What if someone recognizes me? What if they find out about my past and decide I don't deserve to be free?" "David, your past is part of your story, but it's not the end of your story. You have a chance to show people that redemption is possible, that the justice system can work to rehabilitate people instead of just warehousing them." The interview was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at the legal aid clinic. David spent the entire morning pacing, rehearsing answers to questions he imagined the reporter might ask. When the news crew arrived, he felt like he might be sick. "Mr. Thompson," the reporter began, "you spent over 12 years in prison, much of it with a reputation as one of the most dangerous inmates in the system. What changed?" David looked directly into the camera, remembering Elena's advice about telling his truth. "Someone saw past my reputation to who I really was. Dr. Rodriguez recognized that my violence had always been protective, not predatory. She gave me the chance to use my mind instead of my fists. But some people might say that violent criminals don't deserve second chances. How would you respond to that?" David had prepared for this question, but when the moment came, his response was purely from the heart. "I would say that I understand why people feel that way. I was angry for a long time and I hurt people, but I also spent my entire life trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The difference wasn't in who I was, it was in having someone who believed I could be better and gave me the tools to prove it. What advice would you give to other former inmates trying to rebuild their lives? That change is possible, but it's not easy. You have to be willing to do the work, to face the parts of yourself that led to bad decisions and to believe that you're worth the effort. And you need people who will support you through the process, who will see your potential even when you can't see it yourself. The interview aired 2 weeks later. David watched it at the halfway house with several other residents, terrified of how he would be portrayed. But the story was fair, focusing on his transformation and his work helping other inmates rather than sensationalizing his past. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The legal aid clinic received dozens of calls from people wanting to support their work. Other former inmates reached out to David, asking for advice about their own reintegration challenges. Most surprisingly, several inmates' families contacted him, wanting help with their loved ones' cases. "You're becoming famous," Elena teased during their next meeting. "I'm becoming useful," David corrected. That's different. 3 months after his release, David had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during his years in prison. He worked 20 hours a week at the legal aid clinic, attended community college classes in the evenings, and volunteered at a youth center on weekends, working with teenagers who reminded him of his younger self. The work with young people was the most challenging and the most rewarding. These kids were angry, abandoned, convinced that the world saw them as lost causes. David recognized their pain because it mirrored his own. "Why should we listen to you?" asked Tony, a 16-year-old with more tattoos than someone his age should have and eyes that held too much anger. "You're just another ex-con trying to tell us how to live." David looked at Tony across the youth center's common room, seeing himself at that age, furious, defensive, certain that violence was the only